is that going to be?
It is my high honor and distinct privilege to introduce to you the President-elect of the United States of America, Donald Trump.
After a grueling, aggressive, and bitterly fought election campaign, Donald Trump is to become the nation's 45th president in a victory which stunned the world and has been described as having no parallel in American history.
I say it is time for us to come together as one united people.
Trump, a 70-year-old billionaire reality TV star, has never held political office or served in the US military. He ran a campaign which challenged the vision of a multi-ethnic globalist America and expressed his disdain for long-standing political and security alliances. He described NATO as being obsolete and stuck to his America First slogan, harking back to the 1940s. But President-elect Trump takes power at a time of multiple global crises. He will face challenges with an assertive President Putin of Russia, the wars in Syria and Iraq, and the battle against ISIL. We speak with a man who has been at the center of these global pressure points, having served as the top US commander in the Middle East and later as director of the CIA. General David Petraeus talks to us about the problems President-elect Trump will inherit and how US foreign policy might change under his leadership. General David Petraeus, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Great to be with you.
Throughout modern US history, the United States and its values and principles has been the foundation of the global order. Has that now been lost in the aftermath of this election?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I would note, though, regardless of the election or whatever, that there is more strain, if you will, on the international order that evolved in the wake of World War II, on the economic institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, on some of the international political bodies, and really even perhaps on the norms and principles for behavior. There's a bit more testing, I think, of that international order than there has been in some time.
We've seen a divisive election campaign, some would say, in the way it's been fought, the dirtiest in US history. How significant is it to you that America's traditional foes are cheering and its allies bemused, if not dismayed, by this result?
Well, you know, it's not the most welcome of developments, obviously, but I'd also remind you that the American democracy has been quite robust over the years. Let's not forget that all the way back in the beginning, one of the founding fathers, the sitting vice president of the United States at that time, shot and killed the first Secretary of the Treasury in a duel. We, some 80 years later, went through a little thing called the Civil War. So we've seen divisive politics before, and in many cases far worse than what we've just been through. And I think there's a resilience factor, if you will, to the U.S. government, to the U.S. democracy, its system of checks and balances that will enable it to move forward very, very, very well. I'd also just add,
do you think those checks and balances are adequately in place, given the result, and obviously the White House and Congress being in the hands of one party?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. And again, let's remember that the popular vote, very, very close. It appears that, in fact, former Secretary Clinton actually edged President-elect Trump in the popular vote. I think people aren't going to misunderstand the results and think that this is a sweeping mandate. However, this does send a message.
Does that suggest the system needs to be reformed?
No. I think, look, what it does suggest is that people have to understand sentiments in the heartland. And there is a disconnect between, if you will, the coasts and the flyover areas, as they're termed. That's the heartland, and that's where this election was won and lost. And I think, again, there has to be a greater listening to that particular. That's our street. You know, I used to get advice when I was in the Middle East all the time, always listen to the Arab street. In fact, some leaders gave me that advice who perhaps might have listened closer to the Arab Street once or twice. And here I think it's not unwise to listen to the heartland a little bit more clearly and closely than we have in the past.
Would you be willing to be a part of that? We know that President-elect Trump is right now in the process of selecting his top team. There have been reports about who the favorites might be. Your name has emerged on some lists as a possible Secretary for Veterans Affairs.
Well, we'll see. Let's see where that goes.
Would you serve if President Trump called upon you?
I don't know yet. I've felt in the past that someone has an obligation. I have been out of government for a while, that my family gets a vote on this as well, and so we'll see.
So is President-elect Trump has he been in contact? Has he given you a phone call?
I'm not going to go any further on any of this.
In recent years, the intelligence community and the military have become deeply concerned about the actions of Russia. There have been suggestions during Donald Trump's campaign that he could develop a close relationship with President Vladimir Putin. Now, as former director of the CIA, you have all the information, you've seen all the classified documents. Would you trust President Putin?
Look, I don't think this is a question of trust. I think this is a question of understanding the objectives that President Putin has, understanding where there might be a convergence of objectives. We all, for example, want to see the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda defeated. Then also where there are diverging interests, and clearly the support for separatists in southeast Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, the invasion some years ago, back in 2008, of South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia, big concerns, and indeed the activities in Syria, also of considerable concern, in as much as some of these have clearly been part of quite indiscriminate bombing, deliberately, it appears, by the Bashar al-Assad regime, and it appears also by Russian Air Force on hospitals and on sites that are thronged with civilians.
And the U.S. intelligence community released a statement in October saying that the theft and disclosure of Democratic Party emails was linked to Russia. The Obama administration formally accused Russia of doing so. As former director of the CIA, do you think that Russia was deliberately trying to influence the course of this election?
Really not in a position to know. I'm not privy to what it is that they have examined that clearly gave them a foundation to make the statements that they did, which I think is concerning enough as it is.
We saw the Russian parliament erupt in applause when they heard of Donald Trump's victory. Is that disturbing to you?
It has concerns, without question, sure. We have been adversaries quite considerably in recent years. There were hopes sometime back in the beginning of the Obama administration for the so-called reset with Russia. That did not materialize. Russia has not exactly been a champion for freedom and democracy and various other rights that we hold quite dear. So that's why it's concerning.
NATO's allies are deeply concerned about Russia's intentions, particularly Russia's neighbors and near neighbors. They're also now worried, I suppose, that if the Kremlin was to do something, that the U.S. wouldn't defend them.
Well, I think that should not be in question. We have repeatedly established that in Article 5, again, collective defense would be triggered.
And you're confident that that core NATO commitment would still be adhered to?
Absolutely, sure. Look, there may be some desire to see our NATO allies spend more, and I think that's a legitimate aspiration. I remember Secretary Gates, a huge champion of alliances, of NATO, of coalitions, but he was quite critical in his final appearance before the North Atlantic Council. I was there as a commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan, and he stated that, this is going to get tougher and tougher and tougher to justify what we do if you all don't pick up more of the slack. Now, they have begun to pick up more of the slack, in part because of the threat posed by Russia. But is it going to be enough for the president?
Sorry to interrupt you, but is it going to be enough for the president-elect? Because
you have to ask the president-elect for his advisors.
Well, but Donald Trump has hinted that he might want to take a step back from NATO. He has said that any defense of member states would be contingent on increased funding for the alliance. Is that worrying to you?
Look, I think we have to see, as now the process begins of translating campaign rhetoric into foreign policy reality, and I don't have huge concerns in that particular area.
Do you think that NATO does need to change in some ways? The President-elect has described it as obsolete, not focusing enough on terrorism.
Well, there certainly are various tweaks that could be undertaken with NATO. And in fact, to be fair to NATO, actually, just in recent months, the summer, the summit, and since, there have been a number of changes that have been decided on. This will include stationing of Allied forces in the 3 Baltic states and in eastern Poland. It includes return of U.S. heavy forces, as we call them, armored brigade and various equipment sets. It does include greater integration of special operations forces and focusing on counterterrorism and indeed on activities in cyberspace. That's a new battle space, really. You know, we used to have ground, and then we had sea, and then air and subsea and space. Now we have cyberspace. That's a whole new battlefield, if you will.
President-elect Trump has also questioned whether there should be U.S. military bases abroad. He's suggested that there shouldn't be bases in places like Japan and South Korea. Should those bases be closed? Should the troops come home?
We have very ironclad commitments to Japan, to Korea. These are alliances. We have alliance commitments. And my sense is that any review of that is going to conclude that it would actually be more expensive if you brought the troops home and had to base them in a U.S. location than having them forward located where they're actually subsidized very considerably by the host nation governments.
So not going to happen?
I wouldn't think so. We'll see.
Because if the U.S. were to pull troops out of a place like South Korea, would you be concerned about there being a real risk of possible invasion by the nuclear-equipped army of Kim Jong-un?
Frankly, South Korea can more than take care of the conventional threat from North Korea at this point, although it's very important that our forces are there because it expresses, again, that coalition commitment.
If you listen to some of the rhetoric during the election campaign, you mentioned U.S., is that the predictability, the U.S. underpinning of the global order? Has that now gone, the sort of deterrence of there being this overwhelming military might to sustain the status quo? You seem quite confident that that hasn't changed after this election.
In fact, the president-elect has said that he wants to spend more on defense. So again, if you can in particular, I mean, if someone were to ask me what's the most important action that could be taken to help the Department of Defense and our military men and women in uniform, it would be to end the threat of sequestration. This is the automatic cuts that are implemented midway through a fiscal year. If Congress can't achieve its goals with respect to certain budget caps, that's got to end. It was actually imposed 1 year, and it was a very, very harmful effect on readiness of the U.S. military. That's behind us. We've been rebuilding, but again, some modest increases in defense spending coupled with ending sequestration and actually just passing a budget so that the military services know what they will actually have for the course of a fiscal year would be hugely important.
And so then let's talk about some of the other key challenges facing President-elect Trump in the Middle East, the fight against ISIL. The battle for Mosul is now underway, a city you know very well. You were in charge of the area during the US-led invasion of 2003. What is your assessment of how that operation is going so far?
I think it's actually going quite well. I have said for nearly 2 years that there was never a question that the Iraqi security forces, with the enablers that the U.S. and the coalition members would bring to assist it, would defeat the Islamic State, which is the army that is the Islamic State. That's what came in and made short work of the Iraqi security forces in some of the areas in the north and in western Iraq as well. They've been almost fully ejected certainly from all the major cities of Anbar province to the west of Baghdad, then worked their way up the Tigris River Valley. And it just keeps getting, frankly, more impressive, the Iraqi security forces. We're providing the unblinking eye, if you will, of all these manned and unmanned aerial vehicles with precision strike assets. Iraqis have some of those too. And all of this is enabled further by the industrial strength fusion of intelligence, with everything digitized, put together so you can understand where the enemy is, what he's doing, and target him very effectively with minimal collateral damage.
Just to be clear, you don't see this battle as being a total disaster?
By no means. No, this is unfolding as a textbook example of urban combat where there is very high degree of sensitivity to damage to innocent civilians.
The reason I ask that is because Donald Trump said on the 23rd of October in a tweet that the US strategy is dumb and there should have been the element of surprise, and actually he repeated that specific comment just recently after the election.
I think actually they achieved tactical surprise, and I think you have to distinguish here between strategic surprise, which is not achievable if you're moving 40,000 to 50,000 Iraqi security forces and then thousands of American and coalition advisors as well. You are not going to move that number of individuals and surprise anyone that you are in the area. What you can do, however, and I think they did do, is achieve some degree of surprise with respect to the tactical launching of the operations and with the directions that you come. This is unfolded in a very impressive manner.
It's a complex battlefield, and you know that better than anyone.
Well, the battle that matters
but President-elect Trump says that he knows
all the
more about ISIS
President
than the generals do.
Look, let's stop all of the reference. Let's just.
But he's made some very important comments about foreign policy, national security.
I am here to give you my views on the situation. Not to comment on what one candidate or the other candidate said during the election. And we know that, again, campaign rhetoric sometimes is a little bit more expansive than the resulting policies. The bottom line is that the fight that will be the most significant one in Mosul, in Nainawa province, of which Mosul is the capital, Mosul being the largest Sunni Arab majority city in Iraq. It was nearly 2 million people when I was privileged to be the commander there. This is very complex human terrain. Although there is a Sunni Arab majority, there are also pockets of Shia Arabs, there are Turkmen, there are Yazidis, large numbers of Kurds. Kurds are broken into several different parties. There are Turkmen Shia as well as Turkmen Sunni.
So how is all this going to be managed after the battle is over?
Well, that is indeed the big issue, because there will be a struggle after this, understandably, essentially for power and resources.
Does the U.S. bear some responsibility for creating the conditions that enabled the rise of ISIL? Even when you were commander in Iraq, at the height of the war, there were some 27,000 detainees, and as you are well aware, one of those in U.S. custody was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the now self-declared leader of ISIL.
Yeah, there's no question that we needed to reform, and we did. In fact, the reason we got to 27,000 was because I stopped releasing detainees until we could actually get the most extreme out of the rank and file and have rehabilitation programs for those who were left. And through that, we dramatically reduced the recidivism rate, the rate of return to the insurgency, which was very high prior to that. Our special operators used to say that we were running a terrorist training university until we had that rehabilitation and the review process and a much more legal approach to what it was that we were doing. And I actually feel very good about what we ultimately did, but there were a lot of mistakes. Look, there were a lot of mistakes over the years there as well. Firing the military without telling them what their future was. Debathification without an agreed reconciliation process. These threw hundreds of thousands of Iraqis into complete limbo, out of their jobs, without any sense of what it was that their future, and that gave them no reason to support the new Iraq. In fact, if anything, it gave them a reason to oppose it.
And you've said that mistakes were made. Is there a part of you that is concerned these mistakes could be made again?
Of course there is. That's what I've been explaining to you.
All right, but
sure.
it's I guess it's not just about the breeding grounds within prisons and what happened there. It's also about the way people were being treated, what was referred to as enhanced interrogation techniques. Others call it torture.
All things of the past, but
is it going to be in the past? Because we've heard a president-elect speak about resuming certain criminal practices, including waterboarding.
Yeah, you're forgetting one very important reality, and that is that it's against the law in the United States to do that. An individual in the Senate who has considerable moral authority when it comes to how detainees are treated, Senator John McCain, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, gave a field manual that was also produced during my time back in the States as a 3-star the same year that we did the counterinsurgency field manual. He gave this manual, which covers how detainees are treated, the force of law, first for the military, and then together with Senator Feinstein, then the Senate Intelligence Chairman, they gave it the force of law for the entire U.S. government. I don't think you're going to see that law changed.
Let me ask you about Syria. What should be the priority for the next president, ISIL or Assad?
Well, you can't divorce the two. Clearly, you have to prioritize, and clearly the priority has to be to go after that element which is posing an external threat, and that is, of course, the Islamic State.
You were serving as head of the CIA when the revolt against President Assad started. Would you have thought then that he could have outlasted President Obama?
It would have been unlikely, I think, at that time to say that. However, he's an individual who has shown the degree of ruthlessness to do whatever is necessary to cling to power, and he's gotten help from, obviously, from Iran with their surrogate Lebanese Hezbollah. The Quds Force are on the ground with advisors, and then, of course, now Russia, making sure that it will be able to retain its naval base at Tartus and its air base at Latakia.
So given the support, the external support that he is getting, which you've just described, is it inevitable then that he will regain control of the entire country as he has pledged to do?
I don't think so. I think that it's going to be very difficult to put the pieces back together.
He has Russia helping him at a time when the US is far less engaged.
He does have Russia helping him. What they're trying to do, I think, is to establish what might be called a rump Syria. This would include essentially everything in their ideas, everything from Damascus up through Homs to Aleppo, and then out along the coast, Tartus and Latakia. And that would be, in a sense, the new Syria.
Let me ask you about developments elsewhere in the region. Should the Iran deal be renegotiated?
So I think actually the way forward for this would be to have a Republican in the White House and Republicans controlling both houses in Congress. They should get together and get as many as they can from across the aisle to declare a national policy which says that Iran will never be allowed to enrich to weapons-grade uranium, and then ensure that the capability to do that is maintained.
The president-elect has said, I alone can fix it. And when it comes to advice, he says he mainly listens to himself. He says, I quote, I have been speaking with myself, number one, because I have a very good brain. Now, you've watched two presidents, Bush and Obama, closely. In reality, come January 20th, after the inauguration, will something have to change? Will he have to listen to advisors, state institutions, to his generals, and to America's allies?
Well, look, there's no one of us who's smarter than all of us together. And his success has not come solely by him making all of the decisions. He's well known for reaching out, having a circle around him who has expertise. And my suspicion is that you will see unfold over the next few weeks advisors selected who will indeed help him deal with the world that is out there, some of which he knows about, and some of which he's going to have to learn more about.
General Petraeus, can I ask you, you've been involved in operations, you've led operations in numerous theaters of war. Can you tell me about lessons learned in the last decade or so?
Yeah, I think we should take 5 lessons from our experiences of the last 10 or 15 years in the Middle East. The first is quite simple. It's that ungoverned spaces in the Middle East, and also, frankly, North Africa and Central Asia, will be exploited by Islamic extremists. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how big will that exploitation be. The second is that Las Vegas rules do not apply to these locations. Las Vegas rules state that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Unfortunately, what happens in these locations does not stay there. Rather, they tend to spew violence, instability, extremism, and in some cases, like the geopolitical Chernobyl that is Syria, they spew a tsunami of refugees. The third is that in responding to this, and you must respond, this is not a problem that you can admire until it goes away, as they say in Washington sometimes. In responding, the U.S. does have to lead. The U.S. has more of the assets that we really need, that we're seeing so useful in Iraq, the manned and unmanned aerial vehicles, the precision strike, the industrial strength intelligence fusion capability, than all of our allies and possible partners put together times a factor of 5 or more. So the U.S. has to be engaged. The fourth is that in exercising leadership, the United States has to ensure that there is a comprehensive campaign pursued. And then fifth and finally, This is a generational struggle. It is not the struggle of a decade, much less of a few years. This is generational in nature. We will put a stake through the heart of the Islamic State without question. We'll get Baghdadi eventually. You can't do what he's doing and not end up on the X, as we say, sooner or later.
General Petraeus, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
My pleasure.